So, hey guys, welcome back to the History Buff. So we're here to have another conversation in this fifth and final episode of the Berlin Wall series. And for this episode, I am joined by Joerg, a fellow history buff and also fellow tour guide here in Berlin. And we're going to discuss the fall of the wall and its consequences. So, hello, Joerg.
Yeah, hi, Artie. Hello, everybody.
Would you like to just quickly introduce yourself to everyone?
Yeah, well, my introduction as a tour guide is I'm a Berliner since 1988. At that time, we had two Berlins, so I was coming from West Germany near Frankfurt, going to West Berlin, only spiced it different.
Wow.
And Berlin was calling me. I mean, I was not the first one. David Bowie was before me, and I followed up his traces. And I felt like I'm not the guy for career. I'm more for culture. And so I had a good time. 1 year later, it didn't matter any longer. The wall fell. I had interesting 90s. Was a perfect timing,
Yes.
I would say.
For me, the time I would like to go back to most. That and 20s Berlin, personally.
Yeah, 20s I missed, but
Yes,
90s
me too.
I've been here. And I studied a bit of geography and did the usual 44 jobs a man has to do. And now I'm a tour guide with passion.
And have you been in Berlin that whole time since then?
Yeah, more or less. I traveled 2 times half a year to Africa, but I spent most of my time in Berlin.
Nice. Yeah, no, and I can definitely, I just this winter went to South America and it's something that I can get used to, spending the winter in somewhere hotter. So, yeah, throughout this series about the Berlin Wall, we discussed the reasons behind the building of the wall itself and its subsequent generations, its the escape attempts, the deaths that took place at the wall. And in the last episode with Ryan, we talked about life on either side of the wall. In this episode with Joerg here, with someone who was actually there that night, that fateful night in November 1989, yes, which is obviously quite good cred to be able to be talking about that stuff, someone who is actually there. And yeah, he's here to help me sort of discuss the event itself, also what led up to the event, and also the consequences that came from the event, both positive and negative.
Yeah, of course, there's 2 sides.
There is 2 sides to this story. Obviously, the fall of the Berlin Wall stands as probably one of the most pivotal moments, in global history, because it symbolized the end of an era, the Cold War. And obviously the stark divide between East and West was epitomized by the wall. And so it kind of meant that the divide between the East and West was nowhere more palpable than in Berlin. And so when the Berlin Wall crumbled, it marked the end of this defining epoch. So I guess let's start with, the background to the fall, which I guess we could start with Gorbachev. I guess that's really where the fall of the wall started.
Yeah, kind of. I mean, let's say it's a lot about economy, so life in East and West was very different, and it was getting more and more different over the years. And we had in East Germany the Valley of the Unknown. You ever heard of that? Around Dresden, they couldn't receive Western TV.
Oh, okay.
So these guys were, let's say, supposed to know less, but all the others, a lot of antenna signals were going directly to the GR to spoil the population over there and let them see how good life in the West is. You know that?
Okay, yes. No, I've heard about that. I've heard about the antennas, yes.
It's a lot of propaganda. And so people in the East felt like that's a bad system, not only by political freedom, but also by the chances, the possibilities you have in life. I think that's a very important point. And this East German system was overaging.
Yes. Well, the thing is, people forget that in the 70s, the GDR had actually had an economic boom. Maybe not a boom in the sort of Western sense of the word. It had good rising living standards and had a period of economic and sort of political stability. People were content. But I guess, that kind of all sort of changed in the 80s along with most of the other Eastern Bloc states, I suppose.
Yeah, and also a growing awareness that they want to participate in decisions. It was not automatically that people wanted to reunite with West Germany. I wouldn't say that. A lot of people had the idea we want changes in our country.
Exactly, and that's what I discussed in the last episode with Ryan. and is that I made a film about the GDR, and for it we interviewed some punks from the GDR, and they said, we people think that we wanted to destroy the GDR. We didn't. We just wanted socialism, just not that socialism.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, the fun thing about Gorbachev, he had been here a couple of months before the wall fell. And, the situation was a bit bizarre and annoying for the leaders of the GDR because, first of all, Gorbachev was way younger than most of the GDR leaders, like Honecker and so on. He was a new generation. He saw changes have to come. I have to do something. Mm-hmm. And on the street, when he was passing in East Berlin, they all were crying, Gorby, you're our man.
Yeah.
And the leaders were pretty annoyed. They were more hoping that Gorbachev will allow them to use violence against the growing masses of demonstrators.
Exactly. Yeah, because he gets in 1984. And as you say, he doesn't have a very good relationship with the SED, the East German Communist Party old guard. So pretty much all of the Politburo, so the decision-making body of the Communist Party, is full of dinosaurs. I think they call them Betonköpfe, so the heads of concrete. Basically dinosaurs who were refusing to change and I guess specifically move with the time, because Gorbachev was implementing these new policies, perestroika and glasnost. So perestroika meaning restructuring and glasnost meaning like transparency, yeah. And so he's doing these in the Soviet Union, but also a key part of his reforms is that he is not involving the Soviet Union in the affairs of satellite states. Okay, because it's important to remember that the GDR was never a part of the Soviet Union. Like Poland, like Hungary, like all of these other Warsaw Pact states that weren't part of the Soviet Union, they were in obviously the Soviet Union's sphere of influence. In reality, a lot of the big decisions were made by Moscow, but they did have their own government, their own money, so they had some semblance of independence. But, until Gorbachev came to power, a lot of the people in the top communist parties, the top of the communist parties in all of these states would always look to Moscow for guidance. But obviously when Gorbachev came in, he said, no, you guys are on your own. You're not getting any more money. You can do what you want. So, and I think that was sort of really where I guess you could say the cracks started.
Definitely, yeah. And he had a difficult counterpart on the US side, Ronald Reagan. Mm-hmm. He was more a beton head, a concrete head on the other side. But he managed. I mean, he saw I have to change things. And at the same time, don't forget, we had a strong peace movement. And that started in West Germany, but it was also going over to East Germany. Mm. You must know, battlefield of World War III was both Germany's.
Yes.
Some of the
specifically
missiles,
Berlin, right?
No, but the French missiles were going to West Germany. The idea was the Soviets will overrun the West German positions and we beat them there. Meaning all life in West Germany is deleted then.
Right. Oh, yeah, because the student protest movement against placement of American weapons.
Exactly. Yeah. The INF agreement later on. And I think that also created something in GDR. They had a movement called Schwerter zu Flughafen. It's like swords into blocks. Basically, the system was, the difference in the 80s, in the late 80s between a West German and an East German going to a shop.
What?
The West German asked, how much is it? And the East German asked, do you have?
Lack
of supply. You
so
queued up on any queue without knowing what's on the end. You know? So that was really annoying. Bananas, oranges, nothing was there.
Yeah. Well, unless you were in the Politburo.
Yeah, of course. For some, some are more equal than others.
Yeah, some are more equal. Exactly. That's the thing. And, it's important to remember that with the economics, that's kind of the thing, is that people in these communist states did see that the people in the top of the Communist Party, there was still an elite under communism. So yeah, as you said, Reagan also had taken over, and the thing is, Reagan and Gorbachev had a fairly good relationship.
Yeah, kind of. I mean, I remember watching when they signed finally the contract in Reykjavik, the ENF disarmament. I think that was 87, 88.
It was signed on the 8th of December, 1987.
Okay.
Yes.
You see? So a very funny small episode. Gorbachev shake hands with one of the servants in the hotel, and Reagan was going straight, communist leader is greeting working class people. But finally they could get along. And
yes. Yeah, Margaret Thatcher said he was someone that she could do business with. So that obviously shows that he was really quite breaking with communist past. The fact that he was doing business with these two very capitalist world leaders.
Exactly. Awareness, economy is bad, and it doesn't go on with all this armament stuff.
Yeah.
So that gave an impulse, and we had a strong later on disarmament movement in East Berlin as well.
Right.
They were using this blue pigeon, the peace pigeon, and so on. And I think a lot of people lost
They still
hope.
have that today, don't they?
Yeah,
I see sometimes the demos. Yeah.
Yeah, it was one of the carriers was a church in a way. Also, a lot of people didn't believe in God, but they were sticking towards the church and assembling around there.
Yeah.
And the second thing, I think most people lost hope. These dinosaurs will never disappear.
Yes.
So there was no change inside, which is different towards the Soviet Union, where Gorbachev was showing a change can happen.
Yes. No, and there's famous images of Gorbachev, walking around on the streets of Moscow and just talking to people. And that was a very powerful image because it was this guy who was meant to be the big leader who occupied the same office that Stalin had, this big, scary dictator. But he was just going out into the streets and talking to people, saying, and sort of hearing their opinions. And that, don't underestimate how much that had a very positive effect on his image as a reformer. Also, of course, you have other movements like, Solidarność in Poland.
Mm-hmm.
And this was because of the economic struggles in Poland, people became increasingly frustrated with the government's economic policies, and because it, under communist system, largely prioritized heavy industry at the expense of consumer needs. And you had all of these various strikes, and I think that it basically grew into sort of a wider political movement. And so with all of this going on across the border, people in the GDR are sort of looking across and being like, yeah, no. And so it's kind of, I guess, it's kind of a movement that ends up sweeping the whole of Eastern Europe, really. And that obviously, seeps into the GDR, into East Germany. And you have the beginnings of the demonstrations.
Exactly. I mean, one more thing, you had already the Gulag communism in Hungary, which had a half-open border towards Austria. And so there had been slight things. Yeah, and I know a guy who was one of those who occupied the German embassy in Budapest in '88. And he wanted to get out of the country. He was not a hardcore capitalist or whatever, but he's typical at that time, very young with his wife, and they both thought this will never end.
Yes, exactly. And that's something important. That was really a sort of turning point because so all the way through 1988 and 1989, East Germans became pretty sick, obviously, of this system that they thought that was never going to change. And so, people started, because obviously Czechoslovakia and Hungary were a part of the Eastern Bloc. It was quite easy for them to just cross the border because it wasn't a closed border, because it was fellow Eastern Bloc. So, during the summer holidays of 1989, several hundred East Germans sought refuge in the West German embassy in Prague. Czechoslovakia they dismantled their part of the Iron Curtain, and this meant that obviously East Germans then tried to go round it to the west, but then they kind of put up border fencing again to stop people from coming. So then that's when people started seeking refuge in the West German embassy in Prague. And it swelled to several thousand at one point.
Yeah, and it was quite dramatic.
All just camping outside the.
Yeah.
In Prague,
it was very dense, and it was the territory of the embassy finally.
Yeah.
And so in the beginning, it looked like, this will be very stiff. I think it was solved with money, like all the time,
Yeah.
So West Germany bought out West Germans. Yeah.
Well, so there were numerous diplomatic sort of negotiations, and then finally. It was brought to a compromise, and the refugees were allowed to emigrate to West Germany. And it's a very famous video of Hans-Dietrich Genscher, who's the West German foreign minister, announces from the balcony of the West German embassy that these East Germans camping out there will be free to go to the West. But I think you're right. I think they were probably sold.
Yeah, Genscher was, by the way, driven by his own biography, as he was coming from the city of Halle, and I think he even escaped. And so that was his mission. That was his big mission. Yeah.
Yeah, and he doesn't even finish his speech on the balcony, because I think he just says that they're going to leave. And when he says your departure or something like that, then they all just erupt in cheers. It's a very emotional roar from the crowd. And so obviously they had to travel via the GDR, via East Germany. And it's because the East German government wanted to make a sort of example of them and say, we're going to expel you. And so they traveled in sealed trains.
Yeah, it was trains. And of course, some people felt like, oop. But finally, that was dealt before.
Exactly. And to be honest, I think this ended up working against the GDR government. And because I think this whole thing, seeing this train leave, it was like, oh, okay, so it is actually possible. So I think it.
Yeah, but on the other side, that was not the first case. My mother-in-law, she was trying to escape over the green border between Hungary and Yugoslavia in 1971. She was catched in Yugoslavia, officially that country neutral, but
neutral.
They did pushbacks.
Oh, okay.
So they sent her back to Hungary, where she was imprisoned for a couple of weeks, and then being sent to the Stasi prison here, Hohenschönhausen. Where she spent more than a year, and then she was released.
She spent more than a year there?
Yeah, that was a normal penalty for illegaler Grenzübertritt, illegal...
border crossings, yeah.
But then, a couple of years later, she applied to leave the country, what many people did. And that was a way to get out of the GDR.
Oh, and then, the West German government would buy you.
Yeah. You had some horrible years, bad situation, always interviews, not a nice flat, no career. And then finally, if you insisted, you were bought out.
After this, on the 3rd of October 1989, the GDR closes the border with Czechoslovakia to try and kind of stem the problem. But it, I think, ends up just making it worse. And by this point, East Germans are, calling out louder and louder for democratic reforms.
And free travel.
And, two major things, free travel and free and fair elections. That's the two things they're mostly calling for. So these huge protests are going on across the country. Okay, they started in Leipzig, but now they're going on all over the country by this point. By October 1989, you have demonstrations often in Alexanderplatz, which is the central square in East Berlin. And they're actually now started to be attended by quite high-ranking communist officials, I think, who also want reform. And so the pressure kind of grows and grows and grows, and it leads to, on the 18th of October, to the resignation of the long-term leader of the GDR, leader of the Communist Party and leader of the GDR, Erich Honecker. And I think after this, people were like, oh, okay, maybe things will change. But then as soon as Egon Krenz became the leader, people realized, because he said he was a reformer, but I don't think he really was. He was still part of the old guard. So you still have, lots of voices calling out for change, reform. They don't believe that Egon Krenz is going to deliver it. And to be honest, by then, events are moving too quickly. And then on the 7th of November, because it still is spiraling out of the government's control, the entire GDR government resigned. So that was 7th of November. So you had a new government that was installed quickly, whose job was to basically try and sort this situation out. So they meet 2 days later on the 9th of November to draft an emergency travel law. So they draft this law. However, the man whose job it was to then go and present it to the press was not present at the meeting. I always say that he was outside having a cigarette, but I don't know if that's actually true. I don't think we actually really know.
We don't know.
We don't know. To say him having a nice cigarette is just, it's quite funny to imagine him just sort of outside while his colleagues are inside discussing this law. But anyway, he then goes inside and is given a load of very hastily scribbled notes on what the law would be. And he is sent immediately before the press. Okay, so Günter Schabowski, he's the spokesman for the government. This is not the only reform he is announcing. He's announcing loads of different reforms, and he puts this emergency travel law to the back of his press pack, and he forgets about it. So, and then he gets to the press conference, which is full of not just German journalists, you have journalists from all over the world. He's reading out the reforms, and apparently the journalists that were there were actually quite bored because I think he doesn't read out this travel restriction. It's only at the very end that he announces, and it's actually after being asked specifically by a journalist about this travel law. So he's reading out all of these rather sort of dull reforms, and then after almost an hour, an Italian journalist stands up and asks him, like, I thought that was also meant to be some sort of lifting of the travel restrictions. And he then gets out the travel law that's been very hastily drafted, and he looks at it, he puts his glasses down, and he's like, yeah, okay, so private travel to foreign countries can be applied for without any prerequisites, so reasons for travel and family relations. Permits are issued at short notice. He is then asked a question by a journalist, which was, well, okay, when is this going to come into effect? Because he hadn't actually said when the law was going to come into effect. Now, because he wasn't at the meeting, he obviously didn't know when the law was going to be. So he consulted his notes, but it didn't say on the notes when the law was going to come into effect. So I think he just improvised, really, and was just like, and what he said turned out to be one of the biggest cock-ups in history. And he says, to my knowledge, effective immediately, without delay. He had no idea, obviously, what a Pandora's box those words were going to be and how sort of pivotal they were going to be. I do personally think it was an honest mistake. But there is this theory that the GDR were engineering this all on purpose because they were so broke, because, the upkeep of the wall cost a lot of money. There is a theory that they did this on purpose. But anyway, we'll let you know why in a sec. So... obviously, it's being watched live on television. I mean, did you see this?
Yeah, I mean, my impression was, these guys were all a bit corny, in a way, politicians from a different age. And if you look at the guy, Mr. Schabowski, and you see him, you feel like this is also one of the dinosaurs. Also, he is a bit younger than Honecker. And you could definitely see this guy was not trained with modern public relations. Right. Definitely not. So he was completely confused and overrun by a live press conference. That is the first thing.
Yeah.
And so he was not aware that questions will come that bring him into trouble. And before, these kind of conferences were never ever something that is happening at the moment. That was all before arranged and so on. So he's confronted with a situation he was never trained for. So that's for me a clear sign. And then I have this, I mean, you can look it up in the internet, the handwritten note, if you read it. It's not concerning this traveling. It looks like a random notice of someone who, was going over various topics. And this very topic was not elaborated on the note. So, and you saw him and you felt like, this is one of these administration guys from the GDR, a grayish person. And he's in the wrong job.
A bureaucrat.
Yeah.
It's funny because I think, he's sort of regarded as almost a hero these days. But I think he actually genuinely just didn't know what he was doing.
No.
Which is quite funny, really. So obviously this press conference is being watched live on the television. It's being listened to live on the radio. And so people start flooding down to the checkpoints, the various checkpoints in East Berlin. And they obviously say to the border guards, well, we've just heard that we can travel west. But the border guards haven't heard anything about this.
Well, they have been on TV as well, I mean, they have seen that.
Oh, they have?
Of course.
But they haven't had the order.
No order,
yes.
No instruction at all.
Because as we said, if Schabowski had been at the meeting, he would have seen that it was going to come into effect at midday the next day. That's when it was actually going to take effect. Basically, they are, by about 10 p.m., completely overwhelmed with East Germans at the checkpoints demanding to be let through. But the border guards, obviously, because they haven't had an order, they are refusing. And people, I think, do get quite annoyed.
Of course. I mean, they were like, hey, get out of my way. Didn't you see that in TV? What are you doing here? You're standing here as you are not supposed to do, And you can watch that up, videos and so on, that these people were very confused. You must know guys who served in the guards or in the Stasi, in the GDR, were kind of alien towards the rest of the population. These were very strange guys.
Yes.
Nobody did that voluntarily. No person that I personally know was doing this kind of a job. That was a terrible job.
Yes.
So people with a special mindset, and I think it's a lucky thing that nobody was starting to shoot.
I think
let
that
it
was
happen.
probably from the vibe, though. I feel like the guards that night, they knew that if they did shoot someone, it would probably lead to like a full-on revolution.
Definitely.
It was a vibe, I think.
Yeah.
They could, even though I wasn't there.
No, but very possible. But on the other side, some of these guys might have seen as well as the system is going to drown.
Yes.
And that you cannot stop that any longer.
Yeah.
But
A
some
runaway
commanders, I mean, you might have heard in the during the demonstrations at Leipzig, they were collecting a lot of blood conserves.
Mm-hmm.
So some guys had the idea this will end up in a massacre and we need loads of blood.
Wow.
Yeah, that's what you can research today.
Wow.
That they already prepared for a more violent suppressing of these demonstrations. So I still think, we talk about individuals. There was no order, no instruction, and it's good that nobody got nervous or did the wrong conclusion. I'm not sure if simple border guards would have followed an order like shoot now.
Yeah. No, I think it was definitely, they could feel what way it was moving and they knew that they had to move with it. I think that's probably what it was.
Yeah, and at Bornholmer Straße there were 10,000, and you have 100 border guards. I mean, everybody can calculate, even if I shoot 10 demonstrators, they will overrun me.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And that's so at the Bornholmer Straße crossing, which is, I think, at 11 p.m., one of the border guards, he, I think, decides to try and ease the tension, because there is obviously rather a lot of tension, tries to ease the tension by opening the border very slightly, allowing just like a trickle of people through to make it look like they were doing something. But obviously within seconds, everyone sees behind them that they've opened up the gate, and so they all push up together, they bunch up together and break down the barrier. So they then force themselves on through to the west. And then you have, obviously scenes of celebration, jubilation, and I guess you could say unity, because most of these East and West Berliners have not been together for 28 years.
Yeah.
So that must have been quite a time, really. They go on through, they're partying, and that's obviously where you have the iconic kind of images of them, dancing on top of the wall, which I guess you can remember. I mean, if you said you were there, I mean, what did it feel? Could you sense how big of a moment that was?
Not absolutely. I mean, for me, I was 22 and the wall was only one thing in my life. I had other interests at that time. So
if you were in East Berlin, it probably would have meant more.
Of course. Yeah. For me as a West Berliner, I have
You were probably just like, oh, cool, that's great. And then
and a big party. A lot of people were drinking.
An excuse to party
alcohol,
again. Yes.
Happiness, a bit, many people over there. And you felt like, okay, that can be something big, but my family doesn't have relatives in the East or had, and so for me that was not like reuniting with somebody I personally knew, and it felt like, oh yeah, strange, but I was born 5 years after the wall was built, and so for me that was already a given thing. Okay, strange. And the guys or the people in the GDR, they were all German background, but somehow with 30 years of dividing, also two different cultures were created or existing.
Yeah, and I mean, that kind of leads us nicely on to what we're going to be talking about next, which is obviously when you talk about the wall falling, what comes with that is a big sense of euphoria, because obviously a lot of people, they didn't like being locked up in this totalitarian regime. And, immediately after the wall fell, you did have this, kind of jubilation, this elation, certainly in the East. Afterwards, the SED, the Communist Party, very swiftly lost its grip on power. On the 1st of December, it had its right to rule that was enshrined in the Constitution struck out of the Constitution. So that basically meant the end of communist rule in East Germany. And then you had the first free and fair elections in the GDR in March 1990, and this yielded a majority of MPs who were pro-reunification. And so then that took place on the 3rd of October 1990, and that is celebrated every year as Tag der Deutschen Einheit. However, as you were alluding to, I think it's important to remember that, reunification and everything that came afterwards was not universally positive.
No. I mean, look, two countries unite.
Yes.
You expect kind of a conference, you negotiate on equal level. The reality in one sentence was, thank you for demonstrating our rules apply.
Yes. What the West said that.
The West said that. And they were even exchanging most of the administrative heads in the GDR. And in the beginning, there was euphoria, of course, because you also have to know this is the only revolution in Germany that was done by the people.
Yes, the peaceful revolution.
Yeah. How did we get rid of the Nazis? We needed to be defeated by the Allied powers. The German people didn't get rid of them.
Yes.
So this dictatorship now, the German people or those in the GDR got rid of it, by braveness, by demonstrations, by demanding.
Yes.
And a lot of people had no idea what's coming. Me, honestly, I was on a demonstration against reunification. My parents were really angry with me. I was one of the few because I, at that time, was very critical towards the Western world and capitalism.
Yeah.
And I thought, this will end in a bitter
Tears.
experience. Yeah.
Yes. And that's the thing, is that when you talk about reunification, it's fair to say that it doesn't have, especially when you talk to East Germans, the way that it was subsequently enacted, it was not say ham-handed, but it had a lot of effects which are still being felt today.
Yep.
So the most obvious of these was privatization of East German industry, because obviously, and East German businesses, because obviously under communism, it was essentially planned economy, which has its own complications and own disadvantages. But the thing about communism that you have to remember is that it did provide for everyone. And even now when I meet East Germans, I do meet a lot of East Germans who say they do miss quite a few aspects of that. They miss not having to worry about their paychecks, about their rent, their bill payments, about this, in terms of financial aspects, life was a lot easier in the GDR. Obviously, there's a lot of people will say, they weren't allowed to go on holiday to anywhere, and they were only allowed to go to Russia and these places. But there's certain things that I think people nowadays, especially with now how everything's become so expensive, and people look back and they're like, it was nice not to have to worry about money. That was just a nice thing.
Money was just a side thing. I
Yes.
mean, on the other side, you couldn't buy anything with money,
Yes.
so you didn't need any.
Exactly.
But let's say also the social gap was not so big. It was, if it was there, it was more about privileges. Some are more equal than others. That was not expressed by owning millions or billions or not. It was more like, I have a nice house in the countryside, you don't. I have a Levi's jeans, you don't. Stuff like this.
Yeah.
And this you also have to see that the lack of everything created also a solidaric society. If everybody is lacking things, you help each other.
Yes.
So in a way, there was also kind of a nice common sense in the GDR. Not all people, and we had that in the West as well, but let's say the gap between rich and poor was growing in the last 30 years, the harder it is to find this kind of a solidaric society. And but let's say a lot of people felt after a couple of years waking up, where's my identity?
Exactly, that's the thing. And, it's because obviously the world was in a very euphoric place, especially at the end of the Cold War, because obviously, after the wall fell, then you had reunification a year later. Then the next year, you had the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe across the whole of the Eastern Bloc. And then obviously December 1991, Gorbachev resigns and the Soviet Union dissolves. So that's really thought of as the end of the Cold War. So there is this kind of euphoria. But the thing is, it's like, as it got further into the 90s, I think people were like, well, what was this for? Because the thing is, 2 million East Germans lost their jobs because of privatization. There was a special company that was set up.
Yeah, the Treuhand.
That's it.
That was more like a state-run institution administering all the
privatizations.
Yeah.
So a special company, which I think to this day is quite hated in the former East.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, they didn't do it fair, you know. I mean, you were...
They did it too quickly, definitely.
Yeah, and you knew somebody who knew somebody, you could make a good deal.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think that's what a lot of people feel could have been done better. And yeah, it was just that it happened so quickly. So because of the speed at which reunification happened, because looking back on it, I wasn't alive then, but if you look at it, it did happen. Reunification happened within a year. To be honest, after spending, 40 years as different systems, because there is a phrase, even though the wall is gone, the physical wall is gone, you still have the wall in people's heads. And that kind of encapsulates the fact that, 40 years living in a different system, it is going to make you think slightly differently. Someone from a communist system is going to value, if someone pulls out a dollar bill, is probably going to value that a lot less than someone from a capitalist country.
These people were literally screwed up. I give you two examples. First of all, a lot of East Germans, after the wall fell, they felt like, I need a decent car now. Get rid of this terrible Trabant.
Yeah.
Understandable. So,
which everyone was eligible for, but you'd be waiting on average 7 years. Is it 7 years?
Also sometimes 10 to 15. The used one was more expensive than the new one.
Yeah.
So they were going, as they didn't have the means, to the used car markets. And they were screwed up, Car dealers who are dealing with used cars very often are difficult personalities. You, as a person who lives in a capitalist system, you're used to that, and you have to be careful. These guys, they had no awareness that somebody is trying to screw you up.
Yes,
that
exactly.
That didn't exist.
Yes, that's so true. And I remember seeing a picture that really, really fascinated me was in East German who goes into a supermarket when a Western supermarket that had just opened its first branch in the East, and it's with a huge milker cow. And she's just got her trolley and she's just looking at it. She's like, what on earth is that? Because obviously in the East, they didn't have that. They didn't have advertising. Well, I mean, they had advertising, but it wasn't on the scale and with the colors and with the sort of decadence
the
of
variety
the
of
West.
dog food in a shelf in a nice grocery shop in the West was reaching the variety of all items in an East German grocery shop.
And they didn't understand why you would need more than one type.
Butter is butter.
Yes.
Why do you have the golden and the green and the silver one? You know?
Exactly.
Yeah, and the second example I can give you, at that time, the communities, the local towns and so on, they were not having debts. That system didn't exist. So now they are released, and 5 years later, they all had the same amount of debts on their community. So that means they were completely screwed up. They got nothing out of it.
Yes.
Smart guys came, you need a consultancy, and then we have this nice idea of reforming, the marketplace and so on. So 5 years, and a lot of people made loads of money. And what I think is it was simply forgotten to protect these people.
Yes, exactly. First of all, that it happened too quickly, and they didn't think of these people that needed protection. Because under communism, you were basically directly being taken care of by the state. But when that state was got rid of, these people didn't have this protection.
Yeah.
So, I think that's kind of why people are these days sometimes quite nostalgic. I'm not going to say everyone is, because it's definitely not everyone from the former GDR. But you do still meet.
And you had a two-class system. Look, it starts with no East German was in a top position. They were all removed. They were seen as former party members, Stasi. But even more sincere, the economic equality was not given. It starts with, they at that time had a salary by numbers 1/3 of what was normal in West Germany. So when they got unemployed, the unemployment insurance paid them 1/3, which is not enough to have a decent life, The same with retirement. You were maybe 55 when the wall fell. You had no chance to build up something new, and you ended up with a retirement payment that is close to the dole.
Yeah. No, and you had all of these, and also if you're trained in law in the East, your qualifications would not be accepted, and you'd have to retrain.
Teachers also.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's this idea of the West coming in and thinking that everything is better in the West, whereas because also that's the thing. That's what a lot of people say, is that it wasn't reunification. It was the West coming in like a bulldozer and bulldozing everything, including the things that people liked about the GDR.
Yep.
And this was encapsulated in 2005, I think, when they demolished the Palast der Republik, which is actually on my wall, actually. And the thing is, even people who didn't like life in the GDR, they did like the Palast der Republik because it had nice memories for them. And so,
this was a venue for cultural stuff and so on. Yeah.
And so even if you didn't like life in the GDR, the fact that that was got rid of, it really kind of solidified this image of the West coming in and bulldozing everything.
And rebuilding an imperial palace. Come on, that's corny. That's like in China.
And it's also, I don't know. I really wish that they did keep the Palast der Republik because it was a really, really cool building. Yeah, I think it's such a shame, really. But yeah, and that's why I think now, some East Germans felt that their identity was, as you say, disregarded, devalued, and sort of they felt less than. Although I will say I have met quite a lot of Westies who can be quite snobby.
Yeah, definitely. A lot of Westies had high...
Westies meaning Westerners, by the way. Aussies meaning Easterners. Is it a derogatory term, that?
Yeah. I mean, for some people, it's still like that.
Oh, okay.
And so they were very arrogant, thought more or less that these people in general are stupid and so on. They didn't see the point that they had to move and the Western people didn't have to move, I mean, you ask people to change completely to adapt to a new system.
Exactly.
And you yourself, you don't have to move not 1 millimeter.
Yes, exactly. That's the thing. And I think that's where the kind of imbalance kind of came from, really. Cool. We're sort of reaching the end. Do you have anything else you want to mention?
The sad thing for today is, of course, that we have a far higher number of supporters of extreme right-wing ideas in the former GDR.
Do you think that's for good reason, though? Okay, not for good reason, but I will say I think part of it is because they are economically left behind.
Yeah, I think it's still this feeling of being kind of defeated or screwed up. I mean, that's very stupid to support extreme right-wing only because you have a bad feeling. So I cannot respect that, but have some understanding that they don't trust the Western system.
But yeah, it's not that I agree, but I think I can understand the reasons behind why they are voting the way they are. I'm not saying I agree with it, but it's the way that reunification was dealt with, with not due consideration of the fact that these people lived in a completely different system that completely took care of financial, matters pretty much. There wasn't kind of due consideration given to that.
And the strange thing is, this feeling is stronger than the reality, because the town I come from didn't get enough money the last 30 years to keep it nice, So there's one experience: you cross on the highway from Hessen to Thüringen, and the highway in Thüringen is very nice. So much money was going in there. So the cities look very nice. In the urban areas, you have now a lot of jobs, a lot of young people. There's no reason to really complain today, But still, this feeling is bitter. Also, the reality is nowadays no longer that you can say that they are having disadvantages in today's life, maybe in owning property, but not in salary of today, not in what's going on, the future perspective. A lot of people come back. They were leaving the GDR for a while for jobs because all the industry died, as you said.
Yeah, and mostly young people.
Yeah.
That's where the problem was.
Yeah, but many of them
now
come
going
back.
Yeah,
because there's enough to do at home and they feel more comfortable. So that's really a bitter experience, because it feels like, why do you follow up this rat hunters?
Yeah, I think that's the thing. And I know that maybe that sounded a little depressing talking about that when talking about the fall of the wall, but it's just important to remember that for all the joy and happiness that the wall falling brought, it did also bring quite a lot of hardship as well. And, it's just that I guess it's that age-old adage, not everything has a not everything has a fairy tale ending.
But the good thing is, I mean, I have two children. They are 17 and 22 now, and for them, this whole East-West thing is not
such
an
a
issue.
thing. Yeah. No, I think that's true, actually. And because I like history. I mean, I have a podcast called The History Buff, so that should be obvious. But basically, I like to talk about history to pretty much everyone I meet. I like to find out where they're from. I like to know, sort of, where they're from, like talk to them about their country's history, blah, blah, blah. And then often when it's a German, I'll sort of be talking about, the East and the West and sort of seeing whether, kind of gauging whether, like, what their sort of opinion is. And to be honest, definitely most young people are not quite so, worried about those distinctions anymore.
That's not the issue. That's more other things that count, your attitude towards certain issues or whatever. I mean, you always have some, but that's not the main.
Yeah, it's really not. I guess it's because they didn't really have anything. Yeah, they weren't alive when it was there. So I guess you could say the wall in the head is now disappearing. It doesn't look like it's become a generational wall.
No.
Unlike the generational trauma from the war, which I think is definitely still a thing, but I think the wall it looks like it is disappearing.
It's disappearing. I mean, life went on, and we are facing different problems.
Yeah.
I mean, I realized in my life 4 major changes. The first one was fall of the wall. The second one was 9/11, and now we have COVID and the attack towards Ukraine. The last 2 happened in the last 3 years. You know?
Yeah, so it's kind of like time is happening, like just speeding up and it's just happening. It's all happening really quickly. Well, okay. Well, if that's everything, well, thank you so much for joining me. It's been really nice to cover this whole series about the Berlin Wall, talk about different aspects of the wall. And, the fall of the wall, it was a pivotal moment in history. The Berlin Wall itself was, I like to say that, it was obviously kind of not very, it wasn't a nice thing, but part of what I love about it is that it encapsulates this era. It represents this era in time, which to me is really fascinating. I would have given anything to see it, to be able to see East and West Berlin. I would have loved to have just seen. Did you ever go to East Berlin? Well,
of course, several times. I mean, time warp. I was even having a fun story. So I was traveling along the so-called transit highway, so that leaving West Berlin,
from the west,
West Germany, going through East Berlin on a designated
there was
highway.
3, wasn't there?
There
One
was
coming
3
from northwest, from the west, and from the southwest.
Exactly, tough border. And so I was hitchhiking. I was in a car. There have been other people, and one of the guys was an African. And when we were already leaving West Berlin, West Germany, that didn't control us, we were entering the East German border, and they asked for papers, and this African guy didn't have any because he was an asylum seeker. So the East German said, but you don't have a passport. So it was coming to stay in the no man's land because we couldn't go back.
You were going from West Berlin to West Germany, or
West Germany to West Berlin.
Right.
And that was getting very complicated. I thought, damn shit. So I went to the East German border guards and told them, listen, we live in a very unfair system. They were taking the passport of this poor asylum seeker. That's capitalism, so he cannot travel. Isn't that mean? And they understood what I wanted, and they really allowed him to pass,
Wow.
I mean, I was triggering them on their propaganda. They were not these guys believing the bullshit.
No, but you were kind of reverse psychology. It was kind of like reverse psychology.
Of course, they couldn't do different.
No, I love that. Well, thank you for that story.
Okay.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Joerg.
Thank you for being here.
Yeah, it's been lovely chatting to you. And guys, I hope you enjoyed this series about Berlin Wall. Please, like and subscribe if you're watching on YouTube, or rate if you're listening on a streaming service to the podcast. But I've really enjoyed doing this series. So I think what I'm going to do next is, with some tour guide mates, is a series on the GDR as a whole, as in the like the founding, the Communist Party, because talking about the Berlin Wall, it's involved obviously talking a lot about that stuff. So yeah, I definitely want to delve deeper into the GDR as a country. And so yeah, thank you for joining me, guys. And thank you, Joerg.
Thank you for being here.
Cheers. And yeah, see you guys very soon. Bye.